What would you do if you were 30,000 feet above the Earth, sealed inside a military aircraft built to survive missiles and storms, surrounded by trained soldiers who fear nothing on the ground, and then something appeared in the cabin that none of your training prepared you for? Imagine this carefully. No turbulence, no enemy radar, no mechanical failure, just silence, and then a shadow where no shadow should exist. Every human being carries an ancient instinct buried deep inside the brain, older than logic, older than language, a survival switch that activates when something feels wrong before we understand why, and that instinct is exactly what trained soldiers reported feeling inside military aircraft across decades of classified missions. They did not report engine fires. They did not report hijackers. They reported presence. In 1943, during World War II, pilots flying night bombing runs over Europe began describing glowing spheres pacing their aircraft, moving intelligently, defying physics, matching speed without propulsion, what later became known as Foo Fighters. And while official reports labeled them as atmospheric anomalies or enemy weapons, the men inside those planes swore the lights reacted to them as if observing. Fast forward to 1968. A cargo transport plane flying over the Pacific, 12 servicemen on board, clear skies, autopilot engaged, when a crew chief heading toward the rear compartment stopped mid-step because he saw someone standing near the sealed cargo door. He assumed it was one of the men until he realized the figure was not wearing standard gear, not wearing any identifiable uniform at all, and was slightly transparent against the metallic wall, as if heat distortion had taken human shape. He blinked. It remained. He called out. It did not respond. He approached, heart accelerating not from fear of combat but from something far more primitive. The fear of the unknown. And when he was within arm's reach, the aircraft lights flickered and the figure dissolved into nothing. The official log recorded electrical fluctuation. Nothing more. In 1974, a reconnaissance aircraft flying over restricted desert airspace reported a radar contact inside the plane itself. Not outside, not approaching, but moving from the rear cabin toward the cockpit according to internal sensor interference. The onboard systems registered mass displacement in the aisle. There were only 5 men aboard. All were accounted for, yet the pressure sensors embedded beneath the floor indicated footsteps. Controlled. Deliberate. One pilot later described the sound over intercom as boots on metal. The brain struggles when confronted with something that violates physical law, and psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. But when cognitive dissonance happens at altitude in a sealed aluminum tube, survival instinct overrides rationalization. In 1989, during a routine refueling operation midair, a boom operator looking through the rear window to guide the fuel line into a fighter jet froze when he noticed a reflection behind him in the glass. A tall shape standing inside the aircraft, but when he turned, the cabin was empty. He later requested psychological evaluation voluntarily, fearing fatigue-induced hallucinations, yet medical tests showed no abnormalities, no sleep deprivation, no chemical imbalance. The report quietly noted situational stress. In 1997, a transport plane carrying equipment across the Arctic Circle experienced what crew described as cold zones. Inside the cabin, sections of air so freezing that breath crystallized instantly despite climate controls functioning normally. And within those zones, radio static intensified, whisper-like distortions bleeding through secured channels, fragments of sound that resembled speech but could not be translated. One crew member recorded audio on a handheld device. When analyzed later, the waveform contained frequency patterns inconsistent with known transmission interference. Official explanation: atmospheric ionization. Personal explanation from one airman: it felt like something was moving through us. And here is where human psychology becomes important, because fear is not triggered by danger alone. It is triggered by uncertainty combined with lack of control. And nothing strips control away like being locked inside a military aircraft with nowhere to escape. A soldier on the ground can run, can hide, can fire back, but in flight, there is no door to open, no ground to reach, no direction except forward, and several declassified testimonies reveal a recurring detail that analysts still debate. Multiple witnesses, independent of one another, describing identical entities without prior contact. In 2003, during a night transport mission over Iraq, turbulence struck unexpectedly, yet weather data showed stable air. The aircraft dipped sharply, oxygen masks deployed automatically, and one private seated near the rear ramp began screaming before anyone else understood why. He pointed toward the cockpit corridor where, according to 3 separate statements, a dark elongated silhouette clung to the ceiling, limbs bent at impossible angles, head tilted sideways as if studying them. The lights failed for 4 seconds. When power returned, it was gone. The private later admitted he had felt something brush against his shoulder moments before seeing it, something cold and textured, like dry fabric dragged across skin. Psychological review determined acute stress reaction. However, 2 other men reported identical visual description despite being seated on opposite sides of the aircraft. In 2011, an advanced surveillance plane equipped with internal motion tracking software recorded unexplained anomalies during a classified operation. Small shifts in mass appearing on digital mapping displays moving between compartments in patterns too deliberate to be random error. Engineers later insisted it was software glitching under electromagnetic interference, but no source of interference was found, and what disturbed analysts most was timing. The movements coincided precisely with moments crew members reported sudden dread, nausea, or the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The human brain evolved to detect predators in darkness, to recognize patterns in shadow, to sense when eyes are upon us, and neuroscientists have proven that the amygdala activates milliseconds before conscious awareness when threat is perceived. Yet what happens when that activation occurs repeatedly in environments where no predator exists? Do we dismiss it as malfunction, or do we consider the possibility that something beyond our understanding triggers it? In 2015, a training flight over domestic airspace nearly aborted when cockpit cameras captured a distortion passing behind the pilot's seat. A ripple in air that briefly formed into something resembling a human outline before dissipating. The footage was reviewed frame by frame. No conclusive artifact explanation satisfied the review board. The event was archived, not released. In 2018, during a humanitarian supply mission, a young lieutenant wrote in a personal journal later obtained through Freedom of Information requests that he woke mid-flight unable to move. Classic sleep paralysis symptoms, except he was seated upright and fully conscious, and directly across from him in the cargo bay sat a figure with no visible face, only depth, like a void absorbing light, and as he stared, unable to speak, the figure leaned forward slightly and he felt an overwhelming flood of memory that was not his own, flashes of other aircraft, other soldiers, other eras, as if something had been traveling with humanity through the skies since we first left the ground. He told no one officially. He feared ridicule. But when he casually mentioned sleep issues to a superior weeks later, the superior paused too long before responding, then quietly said, "You're not the first." Across decades, across wars, across continents, similar accounts surface. Shadows in sealed cabins, footsteps in empty aisles, cold zones defying environmental control, electronic systems failing in precise synchronized moments, reflections that do not match reality, and the recurring emotional signature reported by witnesses is not rage, not aggression, but observation, as if whatever manifests is studying rather than attacking. That detail matters because human beings fear predators, but they are unsettled even more deeply by observers, by entities that watch without interacting, because observation implies intelligence, and intelligence implies intention. Consider this: military aircraft are engineered environments, shielded, pressurized, reinforced, isolated from external variables more than almost any civilian structure, and yet reports cluster there rather than in open skies alone. Why inside the craft? Some theorists suggest electromagnetic fields generated by avionics systems may create conditions that alter perception, stimulating temporal lobes in ways that produce shared hallucinations, but shared hallucinations across independent individuals with matching descriptive details challenge conventional psychological models. Others propose interdimensional bleed-through triggered by altitude and velocity, thin boundaries at high atmospheric layers where physical constants behave differently, yet these remain speculative. What remains factual is documentation of events that trained, disciplined personnel could not explain, personnel whose careers depend on credibility, not fantasy. And here is the psychological hook that keeps resurfacing in these accounts. The strongest fear was not during the sighting itself, but afterward when nothing else happened. No attack, no message, no injury, just silence. Silence forces the brain to replay the moment repeatedly, searching for meaning, and unresolved experiences embed more deeply in memory than resolved threats. In 2021, during a multinational exercise, encrypted communication between two aircraft briefly cross-connected without operator input, and on the shared channel, a third voice was recorded, faint but clear enough to transcribe a single phrase, "still traveling." Audio analysis later failed to identify source origin. Neither aircraft transmitted at that frequency intentionally. The file remains unexplained. When interviewed anonymously years later, one crew member admitted that what disturbed him most was not the voice itself but the tone, calm, patient, almost amused. Throughout history, humans have looked upward and imagined gods, spirits, watchers in the sky, and perhaps that archetype persists because flight removes us from the safety of ground, placing us in liminal space between earth and void, a space where the rules feel thinner. The question is not whether every account is literal. The question is why the pattern continues, why sealed aircraft become stages for encounters that blend technology and something ancient, why advanced machinery designed for warfare becomes silent witness to phenomena that do not fit into threat assessment protocols. If even a fraction of these testimonies reflect objective events, then something accompanies us in controlled airspace, something uninterested in borders or conflict, something that appears only long enough to remind us that mastery of the skies does not equal understanding of them. And as you continue listening, ask yourself honestly, if you were there, suspended in darkness, engines humming, metal vibrating around you, and you saw what they saw, would you trust your mind, or would you begin to question whether humanity opened a door the moment it learned to fly? This is where the deeper cases begin, and what happened next in several of these flights suggests that observation may not be the only motive. Observation was the first pattern, interaction became the second, and it began subtly, almost intelligently calibrated to remain just beneath the threshold of undeniable proof. In 2006, a classified long-range transport mission departing from Ramstein Air Base carried a mixed crew of veterans and newly assigned airmen, and midway over the Atlantic, 3 hours into stable flight, the onboard inertial navigation system recalibrated itself without command input, shifting their projected path by exactly 2.7 degrees west before correcting, an error too precise to be random drift yet too brief to trigger full alarm protocol. And while engineers later attributed it to transient satellite desynchronization, the pilot swore he felt the aircraft respond as if guided, not malfunctioning but complying, a sensation he described as hands on the yoke that weren't mine. 40 minutes later, a loadmaster performing routine checks in the cargo bay reported hearing synchronized tapping along the fuselage interior, not the chaotic ping of thermal expansion but rhythmic, deliberate contact moving from nose to tail, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, repeating in patterns that mirrored coded military knock signals used for identification. And when he pressed his ear against the metal wall, the vibration seemed to answer his proximity with a final single strike before stopping entirely, after which the aircraft's external cameras recorded nothing unusual in surrounding airspace. Psychologists later analyzing the testimony noted how structured patterns amplify perceived intelligence, because the human brain interprets rhythm as intent, and intent implies mind, and mind implies presence, and presence inside a sealed aircraft with no breach point fractures the illusion of containment that military design depends upon. In 2009, during a mountainous training exercise in Nevada, a surveillance plane, equipped with advanced infrared imaging, detected a heat signature within the cargo hold that matched no human thermal profile, registering colder than ambient yet clearly outlined against equipment crates, almost like a negative space imprint shaped vaguely like a crouched figure. The operator assumed calibration failure until the outline shifted position between frames, not gliding but stepping, with distinct displacement consistent with bipedal locomotion, and as he zoomed the feed, static flooded the monitor while cockpit voice recorders captured simultaneous spikes in crew heart rates measured by biometric harnesses integrated into flight suits. Data later flagged but officially archived under sensor irregularity. What unsettled the crew most was not the visual anomaly but the emotional cascade that followed, a wave of synchronized dread so intense that 2 seasoned officers described an urge to abandon the mission midair despite no tangible threat, and neuroscientists would later theorized that mirror neuron systems may allow emotional states to propagate across confined groups, yet such contagion does not explain why the spike occurred precisely when the cold signature appeared, nor why the anomaly vanished once the aircraft descended below a certain altitude threshold. as if bound not to geography but to atmospheric layer. In 2012, a refitted strategic bomber conducting night drills over the Pacific experienced something that challenged mechanical causality. Cockpit displays briefly overlaid ghost images of terrain that did not match real-time mapping, showing mountain ranges beneath open ocean coordinates, and within those phantom topographies, small luminous points moved in coordinated arcs, and although the overlay lasted less than 7 seconds, the co-pilot later described a visceral certainty that the images were not glitches but glimpses, as though the aircraft systems momentarily tuned into an alternate spatial frame. Avionics specialists dismissed the interpretation, citing corrupted rendering buffers, yet subsequent diagnostics revealed no memory faults, and the crew quietly admitted to each other that during the overlay, engine hum lowered in pitch without throttle adjustment, producing a resonance that vibrated through their ribcages like distant chanting, a phenomenon none could replicate in simulation afterward. By 2016, internal review boards began noticing clustering patterns. Encounters peaked during long-duration flights over oceans, polar routes, and conflict zones, environments characterized by isolation, electromagnetic variability, and heightened stress, but statistical correlation did not negate the recurring descriptive constants: elongated silhouettes, distortions in air density, temperature anomalies, auditory phenomena described as whispering frequencies just below intelligibility. 1. Particularly detailed case emerged from a medical evacuation flight over Eastern Europe, where a flight nurse seated beside an injured soldier observed the overhead lights dim sequentially down the length of the cabin, not flicker but fade in a traveling wave, and within the dimmed corridor she perceived a tall vertical absence, darker than shadow, moving toward the cockpit with fluid motion devoid of limb articulation, and though she blinked repeatedly, the absence persisted long enough for her to note that surrounding metal surfaces reflected slight curvature toward it, as if light bent subtly inward. After the incident, she reported an intrusive memory that did not belong to her life. A sensation of immense altitude without aircraft, wind without body, perspective from above looking down at a primitive coastline lit by fires, an image she could not contextualize yet felt emotionally attached to, raising unsettling questions about whether the phenomenon, if external, interacted not only with environment but cognition, accessing memory pathways or imprinting new ones. Analysts exploring theoretical frameworks proposed several possibilities. First, that high-energy avionics fields combined with cosmic radiation at altitude might induce transient temporal lobe microseizures capable of producing hyperreal shared perceptual constructs. Second, that classified experimental technologies operated in adjacent airspace could generate holographic or electromagnetic projections misidentified as anomalies. Third, that unknown atmospheric plasma formations might exhibit behaviors resembling intelligence. Yet none of these hypotheses accounted comprehensively for cross-decade testimonial parallels among crews separated by time, nationality, and mission profile, nor did they address the most troubling development reported in 2019 when a joint operations aircraft conducting encrypted communications tests intercepted not merely anomalous noise but structured linguistic fragments embedded within broadband static, fragments that linguistic software later matched phonetically to no known language family yet contained syntactic repetition patterns consistent with grammar, and during playback sessions, several analysts independently reported subtle emotional impressions accompanying the audio, describing it as patient, observant, and non-hostile but aware, adjectives that reveal more about human projection than objective data perhaps, but projection itself is data because it indicates how the mind interprets stimuli that defy categorization. Then came the 2022 incident that forced even skeptical supervisors to reconsider dismissal strategies. A heavy transport plane en route from Qatar experienced complete cabin camera blackout for 9 seconds while cockpit instruments remained fully operational, and upon visual restoration, 3 duffel bags previously secured against the starboard wall were found repositioned in a triangular formation at the center of the cargo hold, straps still fastened, mass unchanged, no turbulence recorded, and security footage before and after showed no personnel movement, creating a physical anomaly not limited to perception. Internal investigation could not reconstruct a mechanism for simultaneous repositioning. Without human interaction, and while sabotage was considered, the absence of fingerprints or motive, combined with the precision of placement, suggested intentional configuration rather than chaotic displacement, prompting one investigator to privately note, "If this was a message, we don't understand the language." Human beings fear attack because it threatens survival, but they fear communication from the unknown because it threatens worldview, and worldview anchors identity. If something non-human demonstrates awareness within military airspace, then superiority narratives fracture, and institutions built on control resist such fractures instinctively. In multiple follow-up interviews, witnesses across cases emphasized a consistent emotional shift following encounters. Not trauma alone, but heightened perception, vivid dreams involving flight without aircraft, recurring imagery of horizons viewed from impossible altitudes, and a subtle yet persistent feeling of being accompanied even after landing, as though whatever manifested was not confined strictly to the aircraft but used it as threshold space. Psychologists labeled these aftereffects as stress-induced dissociation patterns, yet dissociation rarely aligns so coherently among unrelated individuals, nor does it consistently pair with instrument anomalies recorded in parallel. Some theorists ventured further, suggesting that advanced propulsion systems generating specific frequency harmonics might act as beacons across dimensions, unintentionally attracting entities attuned to those vibrations, while others argued that consciousness itself, concentrated within confined crews under stress at altitude, could create emergent perceptual constructs projected outward, effectively haunting their own environment. Both interpretations circle the same unsettling center: interaction between mind and sky mediated by machine. What complicates dismissal most is the behavioral consistency of the phenomenon. It does not sabotage engines, does not compromise structural integrity, does not escalate into overt aggression. Instead, it manifests briefly, alters perception or environment subtly, then withdraws, leaving documentation fragments and psychological residue. Behavior more aligned with observation or sampling than hostility, and sampling implies research, and research implies curiosity. Imagine for a moment that humanity, in mastering heavier-than-air flight, crossed into atmospheric layers historically uninhabited by biological life, layers where unknown forms of existence operate beyond our sensory range, and that our engines, radars, and pressurized cabins act like lanterns in dark water, illuminating us to something that previously remained indifferent. Such speculation may sound cinematic, yet so did the idea of invisible radiation before its discovery. In late 2023, a debrief transcript surfaced unofficially from a multinational reconnaissance crew who reported a final escalation pattern: synchronized visual distortion across all cabin windows forming a continuous panoramic shadow encircling the aircraft mid-flight, like an external shell moving in parallel, visible for approximately 5 seconds before dissipating. Upward at a velocity exceeding sensor tracking capability, and although radar logged no object, external temperature sensors registered a brief drop of 6 degrees Celsius across the fuselage simultaneously, a physical signature accompanying visual anomaly, reinforcing the convergence of subjective and objective data. Afterward, one crew member summarized the experience in a statement that resonates across decades of reports. "It felt like we were being checked." That word, checked, suggests evaluation rather than threat, and evaluation carries chilling implications because it positions humanity not as hunter nor hunted but as specimen. As investigations continue quietly within classified archives, the pattern remains unresolved, yet one philosophical question persists beneath the data. If something shares our airspace invisibly, revealing itself only in controlled glimpses inside our most advanced machines, what determines those moments of visibility, and why do they coincide so often with isolation, altitude, and heightened human focus? Perhaps the aircraft is not merely transport but catalyst, a crucible where technology, consciousness, and sky intersect in ways we do not yet comprehend. Perhaps the sealed cabin strips away environmental noise, amplifying subtle signals otherwise drowned at ground level. Or perhaps, more unsettling still, the phenomenon has always accompanied us, and flight simply made us noticeable. As you absorb these accounts, consider the psychological weight carried by those who cannot publicly validate what they experienced, whose professional identities depend on rational credibility, yet whose memories replay footsteps in empty aisles and shadows bending light. Their silence may be institutional, but their consistency forms a mosaic that cannot be ignored indefinitely. And if the next stage of this pattern involves not just observation or subtle rearrangement but unmistakable demonstration, the question shifts from whether encounters occur to how humanity will reinterpret its place in the sky when confronted with undeniable evidence that we were never alone up there. The final escalation begins with a flight scheduled under routine classification, a crew unaware that their mission would become the most documented anomaly in military aviation history, and what happened aboard that aircraft would challenge every explanation proposed so far. The flight was logged as routine, the kind of mission that never makes headlines, a strategic transport aircraft carrying equipment and 12 personnel across a transoceanic route under standard classification, engine steady, autopilot calibrated, crew relaxed in the disciplined rhythm that long-haul military operations demand. Yet what separated this flight from the dozens before it was not visible on radar, not forecast in weather data, not predicted in mission briefings, but embedded quietly in the timeline itself, because exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes after takeoff, every onboard chronometer desynchronized by precisely 11 seconds, not randomly but uniformly, cockpit clock, wristwatches, navigation displays, even the timestamp embedded in the internal security recording system, all offset by the same margin, as if time inside the aircraft had inhaled and exhaled differently than the world outside. Technicians would later insist such synchronization errors could result from satellite relay recalibration, yet satellite logs showed no irregularity, and more unsettling still, one crew member later swore that during those 11 seconds he retained awareness while everything else seemed paused. The low hum of engines stretched into a deep, elongated vibration, his fellow soldiers frozen mid-motion like figures in a photograph, and in that suspended fragment of existence he perceived movement in the aisle. Not hurried, not threatening, but deliberate. Tall distortion gliding between seats, its outline unstable as though composed of layered shadows slightly misaligned, and when normal flow resumed, he gasped involuntarily, convinced he had experienced a micro-dream until he noticed condensation on the metal floor beneath where the distortion had passed, frost forming in a narrow trail that evaporated within moments. What transformed this incident from anecdote to anomaly was convergence, because within minutes of the time shift, 3 separate systems registered irregularities. The internal motion tracker flagged transient mass fluctuations approximating 90 kilograms moving toward the cockpit. The electromagnetic field monitor recorded a spike at frequencies previously associated with earlier unexplained cases, and biometric sensors woven into 2 flight suits captured abrupt amygdala activation spikes. Without corresponding external stimuli, data later reviewed by neurologists who admitted the fear response appeared externally triggered rather than internally generated. The captain, an officer known for composure under combat conditions, reported an overwhelming cognitive intrusion during the anomaly, a sudden cascade of imagery unrelated to his life. Ancient skies lit by unfamiliar constellations, metallic structures hovering over oceans devoid of human vessels, perspectives that felt observational rather than participatory, as if memories were being shared rather than imagined, and though he resisted discussing it formally, encrypted debrief transcripts. Reveal he asked a single question repeatedly, "Why show us?" That question implies intentionality, and intentionality implies communication strategy. As the aircraft continued its route, the crew attempted to rationalize the experience collectively, humor serving as psychological insulation, yet unease persisted, not escalating into panic but settling like static under skin, and precisely 43 minutes after the time desynchronization, the cabin lights dimmed not in failure but in modulation, lowering intensity to a soft amber glow despite no manual input, and in that altered illumination every reflective surface along the fuselage appeared subtly curved inward, as though gravity itself had shifted direction toward an unseen axis at the center of the cargo hold. Cameras recorded the visual distortion clearly enough to eliminate hallucination as sole explanation, showing straight structural beams bending fractionally in appearance without physical deformation, a lensing effect localized entirely within the aircraft interior. Then came the event that would define the case. External radar from a nearby Allied aircraft detected a transient envelope surrounding the transport plane, not solid, not metallic, but measurable as a shell of refracted energy moving in parallel with the fuselage for approximately 7 seconds, matching speed exactly before ascending vertically at acceleration beyond conventional propulsion limits, disappearing into upper atmosphere without sonic signature. Simultaneously, inside the aircraft, every unsecured object lifted approximately 3 centimeters off the floor and hovered in silent suspension, a phenomenon lasting no more than 3 heartbeats before gravity reasserted dominance. And although turbulence alarms never activated, each crew member described the sensation of being weighed, assessed, as though the environment itself had become sentient and briefly examined its contents. Following the hovering event, cockpit audio captured a tone, low and harmonic, resonating through metal skin of the craft, not mechanical feedback but structured frequency rising and falling in patterned intervals reminiscent of language cadence. And though analysts later reduced it to electromagnetic interference amplified through cabin acoustics, spectral breakdown revealed mathematical ratios within the sound aligning with prime number sequences, a detail that divided interpretation between coincidence and signal. The psychological aftermath proved equally significant. None of the crew exhibited symptoms of hysteria or breakdown. Instead, they demonstrated heightened coherence, recounting events with striking consistency across independent interviews, descriptions overlapping in detail regarding the distortion's shape, the frost trail, the curvature effect, the hovering objects, suggesting either a rare case of perfectly synchronized shared delusion or an external stimulus perceived similarly by multiple observers. And in scientific methodology, replication strengthens credibility, yet replication of impossibility destabilizes framework. Weeks later, during classified analysis of the aircraft's black box, investigators discovered an anomaly embedded in visual feed frames captured during the 11-second desynchronization. A single frame showing the aisle occupied by a vertical column of darkness textured like woven fabric yet absorbing surrounding light. And though the frame appeared for less than a millisecond, enhancement revealed faint structural complexity within it, branching filaments extending outward like neural pathways before dissolving into noise. Skeptics argued artifact compression, yet the timestamp aligned precisely with the crew member's claim of perceived frozen time, aligning subjective report with objective fragment in a way difficult to dismiss outright. The broader implication unsettled analysts more than the phenomenon itself. The pattern across decades suggested escalation from distant observation outside aircraft to interior presence, from passive manifestation to environmental manipulation, from subtle emotional influence to measurable physical interaction, yet still absent overt aggression, behavior consistent with progressive examination rather than conquest. If humanity represents a developing species, experimenting with atmospheric boundaries, perhaps our aircraft are no longer merely machines but invitations, broadcasting energy signatures across layers of reality previously insulated from biological intrusion, and perhaps the phenomenon responds not with hostility but curiosity, sampling neural data, environmental variables, technological architecture, as though studying emergent intelligence expanding vertically into domains once unoccupied. In final debrief, the captain articulated a thought that echoed silently through the review chamber. It didn't feel like we were in danger. It felt like we were early. Early implies timeline, development, evolution, and evolution implies stages yet to unfold. If encounters within military aircraft represent preliminary contact filtered through perception we barely comprehend, then future manifestations may transcend distortion and frost trails, emerging instead as unmistakable presence impossible to archive quietly. As investigations remain sealed and reports circulate in fragments across classified networks, one conclusion crystallizes beyond speculation. The sky is not empty in the way we once believed, and sealed aluminum hulls soaring above continents may serve as thresholds rather than barriers. So the next time engines hum overhead in the darkness and you look up imagining only machinery and crew within, consider the possibility that something else may be traveling alongside, unseen yet attentive, waiting not to attack but to reveal itself fully when humanity is prepared to understand that flight was never solitude but introduction.